Right. So first question, how did Yes form?
Cut. Yes formed actually before I joined, so the initial formation was about in 1969 while I was messing about in a four-piece group called Bodas. So by the time I got asked to join in 1970, the group did have a sort of reformation, if you like. I came in and we changed a few basic ideas about the group. We weren't going to use orchestras anymore, and after their second album, Time and a Word, had sort of orchestration on it, and I think really Yes formed its new direction in 1970, partly helped by me, but partly also that there was just a change happening in the musical direction for the group. So it really reformed with the help of me, but really because the group needed a new direction. Is that the sort of answer? That's all right, isn't it?
That's fine, that's
okay.
Great. Okay, next one. What songs do you feel show Yes at its best?
I think the best songs that Yes recorded during my span with the group were mainly in its early period, if I can be so presumptuous. I think that Close to the Edge overall, the 20-minute sort of mini-epic, for me is one of the most satisfying things we did because it encompassed so much of what the group could do and actually did do on that one, instead of going off maybe into tangents and musical doldrums occasionally, which we did start to do later in the 70s. This was the epitome of Yes. It was very energetic, it had improvisation, it featured all the members of the band, and it really did cover the ground. But also I think the same album, Siberian True, was also a personal favourite of mine, more in the live context when it was a vehicle to improvise on. Most probably the third one, last one, is still the same period. Roundabout was a song that in 1972 gave John Anderson and myself quite a special award for one of the most popular songs of that year, and I think that in itself was a nice thing to get, and it rewarded John and I and the group for writing a song and arranging it in such a highly original fashion.
Wonderful. Have you won any other awards for any of your music?
Let me think. Yeah, well, John and I won top composer in Britain through the Melody Maker, and Yes always seemed to win top arrangers, as well as the usual sort of, top bass, top guitar, top keyboard player. So really, Yes had quite a run at the polls, and I think there may be a few other things up in my attic that I haven't looked at for about 5 years. But that's not to say that I'm not very pleased and proud of the various sorts of awards and albums, gold albums that I've got. But I find attempting to live with them is impossible. They have to be stored or shelved or something until some stage in my life when they have to come out again and I need reminding. Maybe it's a bit fresh in my mind. I don't need them hanging up to look at.
Great. What are your fond memories of that band?
Well, one of my humorous memories is that we were on the second tour of America, and we arrived at a hotel and everybody checked in their rooms, and I remember Bill opening his veranda window and saying, "Wow, a swimming pool." He sort of threw off his clothes and jumped in the pool. The only trouble was there wasn't any water in it. And he cut his head, and we had delay on the concert, and would the drummer make the show, and he went on with this throbbing headache. Obviously, success is a very satisfying feeling, so I would say also the Yes album, when it got to #1 in England, was really exciting because it was the first hit record really of any consequence that I'd had, and the group really. It would really put Yes on the map. And likewise the next year when we released Fragile and we came and toured, the timing was perfect and a manager's dream. And Fragile went to #2, so at that time also I was very, very pleased with that. So in a way the high spots, once again, early on in the group, John Wetton and I got together on the idea that neither of us were doing anything after his career had given him the gap and Yes had disintegrated. So we sat and talked about forming a group, and we ended up settling for a 4-piece band. Originally we were thinking of a 5-piece band, but it formed around John and myself's basic initial songwriting ideas, like Without You, a couple of other songs. I think it was, God, I've almost forgotten the songs. Oh yeah, The Heat of the Moment. We'd written a couple of songs like that, or got the bass ideas going, and then we looked for a drummer initially, and once we had Carl Palmer in the hot seat on the drums, then Jeff Downes became more interested in our project and came in and completed it. And then we spent all of 1981 rehearsing. We did, I think, about 3.5 months rehearsing and then recording, and we didn't actually finish the record until January '82. So the group took a long time to form, took a long time to get run in, but it sort of crashed into the running rather quickly.
What songs do you feel show Asia at their best?
Well, I think Wildest Dreams is most probably the sort of song that was really all about the excitement and the energy of 4 experienced musicians getting together, and we could never quite seem to find that niche again. Wildest Dreams was a song of John Wetton's. It had some good basic ideas right from the word go, and also it had space for expansion as the group did arrange it and develop some of the ideas, move up the key at the end. Those sort of ideas are relatively easy to think of, but a little bit harder to put actually into action. And I think Wildest Dreams is one of the most exciting Asia things as far as I'm concerned.
What are your fond memories of Asia? Do you have any diving into swimming pool memories?
Let me think. Well, I was going to cite the predictable, you know, the immense and the immediate success of the group was obviously very gratifying and very exciting because it opened up many possibilities. Doing the videos was quite fun with Godley and Cream, the first 2 on the album. In a way, the group, we weren't quite so loony as Yes were in the early days. I suppose we were individually. We all had our idiosyncrasies, but in a way there wasn't a collective scattiness or looniness. I think everybody got loony on their own, you know. So the overall, my greatest memories of Asia must be really just that it was so quick to peak, and it was so hard to follow. And I would confess that the second album was a real slow, difficult process, and it was musically and technically unsatisfactory when it was finished. So really, Asia was all about 1982. We had a fantastic year. Everything we did in '82 worked. We went to Europe, we played in Wembley, and we toured America for, I think, 10 weeks. So we had definitely had some immense highs and a few serious lows, you know, just to bring us back into reality, because a group that took off that quick maybe was destined to fall quite quickly as well, which I think, well, I'll leave that to the future, because the group's still going without me and I mustn't be too condescending.
Who are your musical influences?
My musical influences really must be in about 3 categories. I mean, initially when I started playing the guitar, there was a whole new thing happening with you know, Elvis and the Everly Brothers, and they had Chet Atkins playing guitar for a while. There were instrumental groups, unlike, you know, there are today, like Dwayne Eddy and the Rebel Rousers and all that. In a way, that was the initial kick-off for me. There was a certain guitar mania, and definitely Chet Atkins has always intrigued me, because he's very hard to pinpoint really what he is. He's a very versatile guitarist, maybe not a very fashionable guitarist, but then come the mid-60s, there was a big change, and everybody wanted to write their own songs, and the group I was in started doing that. We changed our name overnight. We almost changed our coat, if you like. We just changed everything about the group from one week to another, and we became a group called Tomorrow, influenced by the Byrds, by the Beatles, by it was a group phase when everything was a group. And I liked the Big Three. I thought the Big Three were a bloody great British group who made only about 2 or 3 records ever, but they were all very energetic. Similar to, out of the Beatles sort of clone, but they were much rougher and rawer. And I tend to think that that's when the guitar hero started to appear. Brian Griffiths, guitarist, who's consequently disappeared or doing a milk round or something, had all the embryonic stages of Guitar Hero. He was very talented. He had an original sort of approach, a bit like the Kinks sort of. He had that all going very, very early on, power stuff. But then once the 70s came in, I started to sort of mature, I suppose. I started listening to all sorts of music, from Hungary to Brazil, Villa Lobos, classical music, ancient music. I met people like John Williams and Julian Bream. I met people that I admired tremendously, like Les Paul, and I suppose really that third stage was really much more about actual strong musical influences and than really popular trends. So I started to find my own satisfaction out of listening to obscure things like hurdy-gurdy music. It's an instrument you turn a handle on and press buttons. I've got one actually. I occasionally played it in studios. Usually it has a very comic reaction. People just fall on the floor laughing that I'm doing this. But those sort of instruments actually give me a sort of new viewpoint on the guitar. I can go back and imitate or get inspiration from things that normally people would think are inspiration maybe for a different sector of people. So sometimes I look back at guitarists like Big Bill Brunsey, blues players. Really a lot of American musicians have inspired me tremendously. I'm not just saying that because I'm on MTV, but that was my initial thing. But then I realised in the 70s there was a much bigger place than that. And going to Japan last year, connected again with MTV, I found it much more of a cultural place to get into. Before, when I went there, I just starved for 3 weeks because I couldn't eat any of the food because I don't like raw fish. And so really, I suppose, as you mature a little, you can find more things to interest you, sometimes in the same area. And I certainly now, I went to see Segovia about 3 weeks ago. He played in England, and people like that are always going to have some effect on me because you can't play. Nobody can play the guitar like he does, and that's a very important function of an instrument, that you can be yourself on. I find with a drum machine or a programmed synthesizer, you're merely manipulating technology. You're not really releasing some sort of alpha rhythms or something that sort of transcends the grooves in the record. But I like those things that inspire me from within, as opposed just to, I get knocked out, I get a new gadget and you can press this and that. It's great, but it's short-lived. It's a toy. And I think, I still look for the more earthbound sort of things, sometimes rustic or sometimes antiquated. I like old instruments. I like the way they allow personality to dominate them and use them.
What musicians have you played with and admired?
Well, working backwards, last year I played with Steve Morse. He's a guitarist who's had peculiar kind of success. I mean, he's done the Guitar Player Awards, you know, 3 years top guitarist, and I think he's a very happy musician. I hope you're all right, Steve. He's a brilliant musician in as far as the mixture, I suppose, of so many, you know, from Jeff Beck to a bit of me to a wider range of guitarists who, newer range of guitarists who are finding their place. But I was very shocked to find that everybody in the States wasn't buying Dixie Dreg records. You know, I was horrified when I came and realised these records weren't a huge success. They hadn't sold millions. Because over here, when I got them, I thought, well, that's obviously a million-seller record. I mean, they all must be, because they were so ingeniously constructed. Maybe highly technical. But anyway, Steve Morse, I played with him last year at this club in New York called My Father's Place. I had a great time. Several years before, I played with Les Paul in England. That was also very exciting. He threw me totally. He'd been playing 12 bars for about, 12-bar sequences for about half an hour, and then it was sort of, yeah, come up, Steve. And he just threw one on me. Do you know this song? Never heard it in my life before. So I had to bluff my way around. And when you have to bluff your way around with a guitarist as important as Les Paul, after he developed multi-recording, he really hooked echo to the electric guitar and gave it a dimension that it's always relied on. And I, of course, wanted to impress him, and I had to really bluff. So I was bluffing like mad because I didn't know what the chord sequences were. So I've met people who, like Chet Atkins, I mean, I'm talking about guitarists really because I'm more interested in guitarists. But of course, I've met also, at different times, singers who've been important to me. But I've also missed opportunities. Like, I mean, I was a big Bob Dylan fan, and I still am. I particularly like the last album he did with Martin Knopfler. So, but I wouldn't have known what to say to him. Only, well, do you need a guitarist, on your next record? But I think your impression of people usually increases when you meet them, and it deepens, and therefore the few people like that I've met in the guitar world, I've usually gone back and had a good chance to rethink my impressions of them. Like when I met Les Paul, for instance, I discovered that he'd got an arm, he'd hurt in a car accident, and he really, really liked humorous people. He didn't like boring musicians, people who were long-faced and serious, And when I went back and listened to Les Paul's records, I could then see that all this joy in them was a lot to do with this, awareness of humour and not taking yourself too seriously.
Can you describe your perception of the rock music scene in England in the late 60s, early 70s?
I should be able to describe the 60s, 70s period, because I suppose I was quite a part of it, but the 60s to me were really a very naive sort of time, and we were, the music scene, there was the sort of shows, the sort of sound people were getting on stage was really dreadful. I mean, there was no other excuse for it. There was no proper PA systems until 1970, in fact, when Yes bought one from the group Iron Butterfly. They brought one over and we had to go through hell with the customs men to buy this PA. The sound was restrictive until the 70s, but I think the excitement was enough to inspire quite a few Americans to get on the tracks. I mean, I'm talking after the Beatles had become accepted. England carried on making progress and being progressive, and also when Flower Power Psychedelia was happening, I suppose it was happening in America first, it seemed like here we came up with our own kind of music, and the Floyd, Tomorrow, the bands that came out like Stevie Winwood, with Traffic and all those bands, we were really offering a very quirky, original style of music. I think then the 70s brought the, I wasn't going to say supergroup, but more the technical sort of side out. And I think English musicians had always felt that American musicians were very, very talented and technically very efficient. But somehow I think that England surged on a bit more there, and out of it came the sort of thinking man's rock groups, you know, like Yes, ELP, Genesis, blah, 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 you know, quote, quote, quote. But, and out of that, I suppose, was the headache of how do you keep going, you know, and then we started being called the techno-rock bands, and there's some really awful things that really we laughed at, quite honestly, when we used to buy the NME and it sort of said, you know, one of the worst records Yes ever made has got to be Tomato. Well, I sort of agree, but it went on and totally ripped the group apart, you know, and in a way we were leading ourselves open to that by the sort of music and the complexity and the sort of airy-fairiness of what we were doing. So, but of course out of that, America started breeding, you know, the Bruce Springsteens and the, you know, a lot of very substantial artists who are still making records now and still selling really well at concerts, you know, and I think what it proved overall, that sort of time span, is that it doesn't matter how many hit records you have, if you can't get out and play really well on stage, then, you know, you're bluffing a bit. And I think that maybe is what England's going through a little bit with some of its sort of young bands who make very good records, but they still haven't had the experience of performing in the big context, you know, of the 10,000, 15,000 seater. I mean, I'm not knocking them, I'm only saying, well, they've got to gather that experience before they can really make it really come off. But I mean, the people who have already had that experience, like Billy Joel, say, can walk on a stage and get the whole place, you know, 20,000, 30,000 people going, you know. But I think you put I don't know how, I know Duran Duran are doing very, very well, but they're still quite a young band to get all the charisma together and all, you know, the sound, the staging, the music, the order of the show, personalities, all this going. I mean, it's quite a tall order. And it was certainly an interesting challenge that groups, in the quotes that I mentioned a few moments ago, actually pulled it off. I mean, we were quite naive still. When I went there in 1971, the first show I did was in front of 15,000 people. Now really, up until then, I'd only played really clubs and what we call town halls, and then maybe the concert hall circuit, like you know, in Amsterdam and Germany, and quite big places. But suddenly it was on stage at Edmonton, Ontario. Edmonton's not in Ontario, is it? Well, sorry, Canada, but
somewhere near.
Edmonton, Canada, playing with Jethro Tull, and it really was exciting. I mean, it was almost electrifying to be suddenly responsible for entertaining so many people at one time. That was, I think, what I learned out of the 60s and 70s. I hope I learned it reasonably well. I don't forget it. Just how to come on and give them a good show.
This show is about the progressive rock scene, highlighting bands such as Traffic, Jethro Tull, Genesis, ELP, Yes, King Crimson. Any comments on any of these bands?
Then none of them are in the charts at the moment. What's the idea? No, well, all those, the bands that we've been talking about all relied partly on good production. Otherwise, the complexity of the music would never have got through. And sometimes it was a real battle to get the bass part plus the keyboard and guitar. And now, of course, production's taken even more of a forefront, in that a lot of records are just very well produced, very simple musical ideas. And what we were trying to do was have very highly complex ideas well produced, and it's definitely easier to have a highly produced simple idea than a well produced complex idea. I think the bands that I felt excited about. I was always excited about ELP, but really, without this sounding like a put down, because it really isn't. Initially, and mostly because of Keith Emerson, because he had a feel about him that gave him a lot of presence, you know, to me, and I liked that style. I think I liked Genesis a lot when they, just before Peter Gabriel left, and then when Phil suddenly found the voice, you know, and I think Steve Hackett encouraged him quite a lot to come out of his shell, you know, and sing. Hang on, is this question, what do I think of them?
What do you think?
God, what do I think about them? Well, these progressive rock bands of the early 70s, I didn't have enough chance then to really decide what I thought about them, because in fact they were in competition, and when you're in competition with people, you have a rather tainted view of them. I wouldn't say it's a downer view, it's only that there's elements of competition, and their strengths you tend to weigh up against, i.e. Yes, I was in, and Yes had an inner egotism that was rather useful, because we felt that Yes had it all covered. You know, we had great vocal harmonies, a great guitarist, great keyboard. We were always seeking to keep the standard of each unit and each area covered. And as soon as we didn't, you know, as soon as like Bill left, then we had to get, you know, a great drummer in. So really, I remember it more as a semi-competitive musical array, where it was like not keeping up with the Joneses, but keeping ahead of the other groups that were coming up behind you. Because when we went to America, ELP were headlining and we used to support them. But the guys used to be at the side of the stage with long faces, you know, Yes, we're trying to do another encore, you know. There was this, you know, we were always trying to keep ahead, even sometimes when we were behind, we were always trying to keep ahead. I think it wasn't really until 1980 when there was a sort of a lull for me, when Yes split. I could look back and maybe start to enjoy more some of the other things that the groups were doing. But I think Jethro Tull was a little bit of a mixture of 60s, 70s, because when we went, they were already huge, and Yes were totally unknown. They did perpetuate. Some of them had very long careers, which is quite surprising. And i.e. Jethro Tull, I believe, has just crept in the, you know, American top 100 again. I mean, that is a very long career. So those groups must have secretly inspired me all the time, because you know, it was fuel. You know, listen to, you know, hear the new Genesis record and well, they've damn good, got good songs, but guitarist isn't quite as good. You know, there was, you know, when Steve Hackett left, there was a sort of guitar gap in the group, really. And although Mike Rutherford was doing all the guitar stuff very well, it wasn't a la Yes, it's sort of always trying to be the virtuosos, you know, which sometimes we weren't, but we were always trying to be. That's it, I can't say any more.
Do you want to just check, actually, do we cut that? Can you just find out about Outside? Make sure about
Really, Yes formed its new direction in 1970, partly helped by me, but partly also that there was just a change happening in the musical direction for the group. So it really reformed with the help of me, but really because the group needed a new direction. Can't. Is that the sort of answer? That's all right, isn't
That's
it?
fine, that's
Okay.
great. Okay, next one. What songs do you feel show Yes at its best?
I think the best songs that Yes recorded during my span with the group were mainly in its early period, if I can be so presumptuous. A favourite of mine, more in the live context, when it was a vehicle to improvise on. Most probably the third one, last one, is still the same period. Roundabout was a song that in 1972 gave John Anderson and myself quite a special award for one of the most popular songs of that year, and I think, you know, that in itself was a nice thing to to get, and it rewarded John and I and the group for writing a song and arranging it in such a highly original fashion.
Wonderful. Have you won any other awards for any of your music?
Let me think. Yeah, well, John and I won top composer in Britain through the Melody Maker, and Yes always seemed to win top arrangers, as well as the usual sort of, you know, top bass, top guitar, top keyboard player. So really, Yes had quite a run at the polls, and I think there may be a few other things up in my attic that I haven't looked at for about 5 years. But that's not to say that I'm not very pleased and proud of the various sorts of awards.
Right. So first question, how did Yes form?
Cut. Yes formed actually before I joined, so the initial formation was about in 1969 while I was messing about in a four-piece group called Bodas. So by the time I got asked to join in 1970, the group did have a sort of reformation, if you like. I came in and we changed a few basic ideas about the group. We weren't going to use orchestras anymore, and after their second album, Time and a Word, had sort of orchestration on it, and I think that Close to the Edge overall, the 20-minute sort of mini epic, for me is one of the most satisfying things we did, because it encompassed so much of what the group could do and actually did do on that one, instead of going off maybe into tangents and musical doldrums occasionally, which we did start to do later in the 70s. This was the epitome of Yes. It was very energetic, it had improvisation, it featured all the members of the band, and it really did cover the ground. But also I think the same album, Siberian True, was also a personal